Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 14. Spartacus left Sarai after devoting years of his life to the young city, and it was already showing signs of greatness as a result. Not only did it command fine and previously untapped lands, fertilized by the Dikos River, but Spartacus had organized a free alliance with the peoples known as the Bactrians, who when they were not drunk or reveling in Persian pastimes, controlled the southern end of the Hyrcanian Ocean. These were a people whom Alexander of Macedon had established at the frontier of the world, of his empire, to carry on the legacy of civilization in a land that might not otherwise feel the warmth of such things. It is usually lamented that the colonists made to go there were criminals and undesirables, yet from what I can tell, they dealt with Sarai in a proper fashion, and supplied many useful crafts to Sarai which were too expensive for the city to purchase by road from the west. So let us not be so hasty to denigrate these peoples that Alexander placed such a burden upon, even though I will admit I have never had a conversation with someone from that region without wishing that I was in different company. Perhaps they will become more worldly when the world of the modern age is complete, but such speculations are outside of our syllabus here. At last, then, the king came to Tanais, entering his old household for the first time since his family had been cruelly taken from him there. Despite the town having grown enormously in his absence, he was characteristically unmoved by it, and indeed it still paled in comparison to Panticapaeum, his city of birth, or even Chersonesus. Yet both of those cities were ash and ruin, and Tanais was vital and whole. Can there be any doubt that the former did not beget the latter? Tanais was full of foreigners, usually merchants, but also sometimes politicians, who had come to visit the royal court. Many such dignitaries were kept in accommodations that had been built on the same street that led to the modest palace. These accommodations were said to be the largest of their kind in the world, and featured rooms and kitchens serviced by good quality slaves bought from Trapezos. As well as being a point of interest in the character of Tanais, this building serves a purpose to our telling of Spartacus's fate, for from these guest houses came many wealthy and politically connected men with eager questions for the king. Spartacus's reputation as a stern but fair ruler had been inflated greatly by his absence, and the mythos around the wild Bosporan king civilizing forgotten lands had taken hold across the Black Sea. Thus plenty were eager to see what sort of king could hold an empire so effortlessly, and in looking to answer that question, they were looking straight through a gem that warped the nature of time in order to bring out the images and ideals of that lost era in which the wastelands of the north were the cradle of civilization. Yes, they saw a king who had no grace, no majesty even, but was as vital to the empire as a heart is to a man. A golden king. But in the conference and symposium that was organized to mix these curious people, it was largely not foreigners looking to hear the words of King Spartacus, but Spartacus listening to words brought from places he may even have been surprised to learn were part of his own domain. I speak of the third cadre of visitors to Tanais, who had recently arrived upon 500 horses, said to all be of different breeds, although I have never heard any expert claim that there are so many distinct breeds of horse. So let me cover the most important things that were achieved over the month-long festival this confluence of people wrought upon Tanais in the spring of 178 prior. Of those gathered to represent their rulers with good authority, the most important were men of the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Empire of Pergamon, and the kingdom of Trapezos. The first of these three was the dynasty that held the old polity of the Nile River under its sway, although not all that firmly, as we shall be learning shortly. The latter two were names given to the domains of two eponymous city-states which had come to control most affairs of Asia, and hence had countless ports on the Black Sea. Through these they had become dependent on Bosporan goods, since the types of items available to purchase at Tanais now ranged from rare white furs from the Morrow frontier to rich and colourful jewels produced by the Hyrcanian colonies, to say nothing of the amounts of cereal crops, slaves, and animals that were becoming available through the first lands. Like all city-states, be they Greek, Pontic, Persian, or any other persuasion, their outlook on politics was determined by two great tides. Firstly, a fear of Rome. Secondly, awe of the Spartokids. Both brought them to Tanais in a natural fashion. but you would be aghast to see that when formal greetings were made, these cities had their men bow in a respectful fashion, while the men from Alexandria of the Ptolemies pressed their heads to the ground and brought out treasures as if they had been defeated in battle, despite their obvious knowledge of the Greek way of doing things in this regard. What was the meaning of this? I shall tell you what I have learned, much of which was not to be found in the official records. The Ptolemaic royal family controlled a domain that was, like the Bosporan realm, awash with peoples who had lived in those places since the earliest possible times, and were generally used to selecting their own governments, for better or worse. However, since the Egyptians, and the myriad minor peoples this name represents, had given up their independence in the time of Alexander, they were now subject to kings of Macedonian descent, whose eyes were forever looking north across the sea, and not south to the strange places where their people lived. Indeed, it is said that all manner of monsters can be found on the course of the Nile, such as men who have no heads, snakes with mouths at both ends, and large beasts that can cross from the horizon behind which they hide to any point in the landscape in which a traveller might stumble, and hence take them to otherworldly places the Egyptians have no end of stories about. There are two large schools of thought concerning the reason why these lands have such phenomena, while being, by the accounts of the Ptolemaic court, incredibly wealthy, well populated, and constantly in production of fine wares. The first is the so-called Alexandrian heresy, as people call it today, although it was in those times called, more lyrically, the flow of history theory. This theory contends that the lands surrounding the Nile, and especially its little understood far reaches, were either present in the world at the same time as the first lands, or even before. And the aspect of this that brings criticism from all corners is that proponents of this claim say humans were already living in these places before the time of Manos. Quite rational people have been convinced of this, so I feel obligated to tell you what the mistake they made was. They will point out that there is evidence of mankind having lived along the Nile for thousands of years, perhaps even very long periods of up to 10,000 years in the view of some. They will claim that this places these people on lands that, according to the scions of gold, should not exist so early. They will point out that because the Golden Age was known to have concluded around 3,000 years ago, that there must be some credence to the ancient records the Egyptians sometimes claim to have. The flaw in this theory is so obvious that only one truly committed to not knowing the truth could fail to see it, which goes to show that the curse of insufficient knowledge is something that afflicts the intelligent as well as the dull. The Alexandrians failed to note that the length of the Golden Age is not a specific length of time against which material findings can be measured, and indeed our very ideas of time all begin after the Golden Age, since before then there were powers in the world that altered time according to schemes we are no longer privy to, for example the aforementioned Hyksos. Therefore all comparisons with uncovered records, if we grant that they are legitimate, are null and void for the reason that years of our age are as incomparable to years of the Golden Age as a taste is to a number, and indeed you'll find that when you subtract your favourite number from your favourite taste, you are not given any concept that sits still in reality, let alone possesses any practical use. In conclusion, while we might be able to grant that the Nile lands were among the first, their creation almost certainly did not come before the death of Manos, and all theories that rely on said chronologies are flawed in their conception of reason. You will find plenty of people who deny this, but they do so by avoiding my damning arguments rather than refuting them, and so we are safely beyond the point of considering their claims to be anything other than childish outbursts. So then I will tell you the more dependable way to consider Egypt, in light of its many curses. This is the second school of thought, and is called Illness of the Last Lands. As implied by the popular title, we believe that the Nile was among the last of the places to be created by the powers of the cosmic tripartite, and that it was in the latter portion of the Golden Age in which this occurred. The significance of this is that the power of creation was stemming not from godliness or passion for order, as it once was, but from the out-of-control exchange of life and blood occurring because of the wars all over the world. The confusion of souls being extinguished in this fashion created unusual places on the peripheries of civilization that can be found in all directions, with Egypt being only the most well explored, since its river is wide and navigable. It is even said that the African desert itself was converted to be this way from a lusher state by the tribulations of the Golden Age collapse, although personally I find the evidence for this inconclusive. That aside, the lands of Egypt were the crossroads of ancient curses and access to civilized ways, and hence there was that great kingdom of misfortune that the Ptolemies sought to master, and in that search, they went from the last lands to the first, and put the matter to the conference at Tanais. It is fortunate for them, and Spartacus too, that answers to these questions and more would be forthcoming from the Scions of Gold, who were able to educate the foreigners about all the things I relayed already concerning the history and nature of the world. Records of these lessons were transcribed by all the literate slaves available in the city, such that they could be referenced in several languages once they were ferried back to the visitors' home countries. This was, I believe, the beginning of the modern written tradition of Lithosis lore, for which the Scions of Gold would become famous around the world. Since these early versions still contained many mistakes, I will not laud them too highly, yet the spirit of producing knowledge endlessly from a single source had taken root, and it was from this guidepost that a route to the truth of Manos was refreshed in the destiny of our kind. There is one aspect of the canon recorded at this time which differs from what I told you was true before, but which is widely considered to be true today. That is the matter of Eumo's relationship to Manos. I once informed you, in the original chronicles of the Lithosis, Eumo was the younger brother to Manos, but this relationship was changed by the Scions of Gold to be that of father and son. There are several reasons that I believe are behind this. Primarily, it is because Eumo was a god of dark and Manos of light. While this distinction is not meant to imply the good or bad of either, it was preferred that if Eumo and Manos were siblings, they both be gods of light. Because of the mistaken assumption that light gods are superior rulers, there was no wish among the Bosporan elite to denigrate their tradition of having siblings be of like status in noble houses by implying that one of the founding siblings might be evil. For example, it was Pyrrhosides who was heir to the empire after Spartacus, and not Spartacus's own offspring, and so how could such a tradition exist in a world that was created by beings who showed that siblings are not equally good? Again, this stems from a misconception, but like many notions springing from such sources, it became real and worrisome. This is why the idea that Eumo was a son came about, in conjunction, I believe, with the fact that many legends and minor religions of the world at the time featured interactions between parents and children more so than between siblings, rendering the child Eumo paradigm less contentious. So it was that the official founding tripartite became the father Manos, the son Eumo, and the spirit of Taurus. To some extent, Taurus was considered still alive, in a way Manos and Eumo were not. And so this third spirit element was to be the active participant in the world on behalf of the tripartite body. This was an aspect of the Scions of Gold agreed upon in the beginning. Now that you have learned what the foreigners and Bosporan royal court had learned at Tanais, I should tell you the material consequences of these days. The courts of the Asians were to be visited by the sages of the First Lands, and provided with embassies in Tanais, Chariskos, and later Apollon. This latter point arising from contention over where the most politically relevant ruling bodies of the empire were located. Treaties of alliance were signed on the condition that the sages be allowed to carry on their work, although no state was obligated to give this religion any special treatment. Many Aegean islands, notably Rhodes and Crete, also joined the alliance, although they were likely simply looking to escape from Rome by moving behind Bosporan shields. The largest treaty was between the House of Ptolemy and the House of Spartacus, which was specifically not between the empire each ruled, between the states, but more akin to a contract between families engaging in legal business. It detailed that huge sums of money would be provided to the Spartokids in exchange for giving over one of their family to serve the Ptolemies, with the goal of recreating the miraculous unity of the Bosporans among the Egyptian peoples. This was not an especially important task, but one gets the feeling that since Spartacus was at last given sole discretion over an enormous decision that would decide the fate of much of the world, he preferred to act than to not act, even if the balance of things was a little sour. That is why ships and troops were prepared at Tanais, many veterans of Chersonesus and Sarai, and were given over to Dion, Spartacus's only son. He was not being dispatched for adoption, but the relevant rites were performed as if he were. Dion insisted upon this, and I believe it is because he was afraid of what might happen if traditions such as these were not given proper credence in times when strange men were being allowed to dictate many things. And in this Spartacus likely shared concern, since he wrote strong edicts over the coming year that cemented the legal status of all religions, bolstering the syncretic tradition of the old Bosporan colonies. He also ensured that the Scions of Gold were not permitted to teach their ways without accompaniment by scholars of Greek training, so that nothing too unusual or foreign would undermine the ways of life that were well known to be effective, be they derived from ancient truths or not. There is an illustrative anecdote from this time that I enjoy. Spartacus happened to learn that one of the leading men at court had failed to teach his son how to ride a horse. Furious at this neglect, he went to the boy in person and directed slaves to assemble a training ground directly outside of the boy's house. When the father returned, he found his boy speaking of the two schools of riding formerly taught in Chersonesus, those being Thessalian and Scythian fashions. And while Spartacus had retreated to other business, the humiliation inflicted on the household was such that no riding coach was ever short of students again. There is value and advancement to be had when a king has properness at the forefront of his mind. And as much as he might sneer at it, the Scions of Gold will tell you precisely this, and reference the king by name. We are fortunate indeed that the Spartokids were so gifted with men who appeased the gods of new and old alike. Now, with that business discussed, I shall tell you a few things that happened in the equally royal house of Pyrrhosides, 8,000 studies away. The year 178 was busy in Apollon, for the same Scions of Gold who were bringing the first canon to the empire were also at work establishing additional truths and finer rhetoric from all sources they could find. The city was inundated with scholars of all kinds, by which I mean there were some with formal training and a long history of thought, and others who were known to possess great knowledge on particular topics, yet lived meagre lives in places and among people who did not value such things above more base work. Pyrrhosides and Gwenna Greek-speaker, who had aged considerably while she was away, now appearing more akin to how she had been at her first meeting with the Bosporans, oversaw this soup of wisdom. There was so much disagreement and contradiction that any progress on establishing either an accurate history or a wise guide for future acts was agonizingly difficult. Yet the confidence, or rather insistence, of the Greek prince and Luthos' queen that the business was destined for success compelled others to ignore the dizzying madness of the whole endeavour. Gradually, ideas of legal measures began to emerge from the broth, which tended to follow a trend that humans were categorized by this name first and all others second. That is to say, an effort should be made to enforce a lack of distinction between the many peoples of the empire, although this seemed very unnatural. For example, to call oneself Greek was wrong, for what separates the behavior required of a Greek from, say, a Macedonian is not worthy of consideration when one focuses instead on acting as a human should act, in the vein of Manos and his creation. These ideas were not all that popular, and nor are they today, even if most have come to accept their merits. It is the liberation of finding yourself alone in the middle of a calm ocean, and one is forced to wonder why their own spirit protests against what is supposedly the way we were designed to live by greater beings. Most people feel this way about the will of the gods at various points in their life, but we know now that this was justified, whereas going against the Scions of Gold cannot be so, yet so often evokes the same dysphoria. Well, these troubles, admittedly lesser than those we had in the past, began from the thought that became popular among the scholars of Apollon when the Scions of Gold were being made, so blame or praise them as you see fit. Pyrrhosides was also made to take part in some business involving his son, and while many writers choose to alter the tale here so that it all fits into one scheme or another, I say to you that these proceedings infuriated the prince. I speak of the ambitions of his heir, Dorius, ambitions his father was blind to, for they seemed so utterly absurd. Dorius had come into his own as a prospector of common concerns, travelling around the environs of Apollon in a manner that mirrored his father, but while Pyrrhosides saw unruly people whose loyalty to Manos was yet to be determined, Dorius saw people whose circumstances were markedly worse than they had been in prior years, since so many families had lost their men to the war. He began to envision a method to provide recompense from the Empire to its new people by building a new city and granting lands to the destitute. After carefully waiting for Pyrrhosides to be absent, he addressed the court at Apollon with these words. "When I was young, I was told that in my lifetime I would come to understand what the purpose of this world was. Alas, I was disappointed to learn that the answer was simple and always within reach: to be, to live, and be apart from a cosmos that abhors us. This was Manos's purpose, and he provided mankind with method and means to have this reality carry on in perpetuity, ever aside from the malice that defines all other worlds. The will of the gods, malicious or merciful, seeps in and corrupts that vision. How? Through us, through good men. How many heroes brought unimaginable suffering to this world? Who would dare even think of answering that? Are you shocked I would ask it? If so, then be not afraid, and do not reel as if my spear point has passed through your breastplate. This is victory, not defeat, to see these questions again, to hear words that once would have been on the lips of all. To extinguish the suffering in this world, we are required to close off all fonts, all springs, all sources, and be those our very lives, our very beings, then we must rejoice that we will one day die, and that in life we have the power to undo, to redo, to bring order to each tiny piece of the world that our hands can reach. That is how it was in the Golden Age, you see. So then I bring to you the case of the day. The question of the people whose need for food and shelter causes them to harass and cajole the established subjects of this city daily, or more frequently. Those denied shelter will come to seek it once per day, those denied food will come to seek it twice per day, and those denied the true wisdom of the founding gods will seek it at each moment they are conscious, and learn nothing of any use because of it. What are we to make of this? The answer depends on who we are. Are we leaders? Are we those fit to organize mankind? If so, we are required to do something to remedy this problem. We should slaughter them all. I have heard voices in this chamber say as much. True, a problem solved that would bring, at least until the horrid nightfall of tortured souls to follow. But this is not the reason we were given our rank by fortune. Listen at least to the notion that there was a reason at all. In the Golden Age, all was in order, and those who were in need were like nuggets of gold to be snatched up, for in solving their problems, order is enhanced, and the entire world is the beneficiary. It is hard for us to see this. You will look upon me and see a young man attempting to preach to the old and wise on a topic you have already given much thought, and your conclusions have settled as silt in the depths of your belly. If that, though, is what you call wisdom, then you are playing into the hands of the jealous gods. Imagine their envy if they saw that it was you the people worshipped and gave thanks to, and not they. They must avoid this world coming to order at all costs, so they lie to you, to your very eyes. Scratch through the reality that has been painted before you, and see that Manos made the path to harmony easy long ago. We now begin to see that path, and the first step, the very first tack towards that euphoric course, is to make amends for the ills we spawned in coming to learn of all this. That is, we should undo the war we wrought, no matter how well fought and necessary it was. Do not spill blood for which the earth does not thirst. That is disorder. Do not cast dark shadows in places that should glow brightly in the sun. That is disorder. We are not beings of disorder, not yet, because the gods have failed to corrupt us thus. We are now things of good, things of light, of gold, scions of gold. What I ask of you is of trivial expense, and what will be asked of you in the future will be hundreds of times more expensive, and will be equally trivial, and you will see these efforts, costs, changes, personal sacrifices, and you will give them over to the world like a dirty blanket before you turn back to your basking in the rising sun. Yes, friends, it must be because I am young that I see it this way, and the happiness that could infect this world is too much for me to bear alone, and the scale of our victory against the gods, to create an everlasting world that is for us, mankind, and entirely for us. This is more grand and great an ambition than anyone has ever held, and it is also, fellow kings of men, astonishingly easy. He supposedly spoke like this until the courtiers had mostly departed for one reason or another, and the next day when he returned and looked like he was about to take the floor again, the court granted him everything he needed. The Getae in the city were delighted, and a guiding strike into their nostalgia for the old kings was made. Like his father would have done, Dorius celebrated in the lowest streets of the city, and even brought commoners into the citadel during the night. As one might suspect of an energetic young man, his cavorting with the widows of the land was not entirely political in nature. He had come to love a Thracian woman named Pasiphae, and it is with great interest that I note how almost every source from this time seems to make awkward grammatical maneuvers to avoid ever mentioning this name, since that was the whim of Pyrrhosides at the time. Dorius took this woman to Apollon and arranged for himself to be married to her. Once the preparations were so far along that it would be quite a scandal to undo them, he allowed the business to be revealed to his father. Obviously, there was first the anger that a child could be so insubordinate on such a crucial matter. Then there was the duty of the dynasty to consider. Dorius was second in line to the rank of king, and in marrying outside of dynastic politics, he was openly humiliating all those Bosporans who remained inside, not to mention squandering any military or social boons that a powerful marriage could bring to the empire. Since Dorius was fully aware of these issues, and entirely without care for them, he had arranged his marriage such that it would be public knowledge if anything were to alter its course. Furthermore, since he was marrying a local of a sort, the idea was extremely popular with the lesser nobility and commoners of the region. He had placed his own father in such a position that no move could be made without significant cost, and hence the course of events went precisely as Dorius desired. With a cool smile, he carried out his wedding with a mix of Bosporan, Thracian and Dacian customs, carefully crafted to symbolize the wish he had for the world. Attendees who wrote of it were impressed at the young man's air of rebellion and kingliness, even if they were so cowed by the atmosphere of the court that they would still not name the bride. Now, the two projects Dorius had launched came together, for it was Pasiphae herself who guided an expedition to see an ideal opportunity for the new city Dorius dreamt of, the sprawling ruins of once mighty Philippopolis. It was located in Thracia proper, on the southern side of the Istros, and was a place that once had been a city of mixed Macedonian and Thracian peoples who had drifted between the spheres of influence of Greeks, Odrysians and Getae, until finally being made a mark of the Romans, who came and burned the city down to make an example while marching south to enact their domination of the Greek states. What was in the time of Philip II of Macedon considered Thracia's greatest city, then augmented to new heights by the renovations that the Macedonian Basileus gave alongside his name, was wiped out in a matter of days by killers trained from birth to follow orders no matter the damnation they would bring. Little was left standing, although the ruins still had plenty of worked stone to recover, and the hinterlands had trails and cleared farmland not far from being put to use once again. Dorius went to this place several times, and finally he stayed there with a crowd of those willing to trust the hand of aid he was extending to vanquished peoples. It seems admirable and enterprising to most who hear of all this, yet Pyrrhosides was disappointed by the outcome. We know this from Diotrephes' letter to Spartacus, in which he requests that the king come and make it such that Pyrrhosides could not be blamed for recalling his son to continue being groomed as a future heir. He was, I say, using an appeal to duty within the dynasty to try and enact his personal wish to have his son close at hand, to share in the great things Pyrrhosides was planning, and there may have been a bitterness to the realization that Dorius might achieve different things that would come to be called great if only he was not made to sit on the arm of his father's throne. And that, of course, is something that Pyrrhosides himself was deeply and keenly aware of, or was once, and I wonder with unending curiosity how he felt to see fortune give him this edifying experience. I think there is no conclusion to it that he could have felt was better than any other, and thrashing against a cage of regrets was all there was. Although I do allow myself to be carried away, since in truth we cannot know this. That appeal to Spartacus likely reached him promptly by the increasingly organized messenger relays the empire was spending vast amounts establishing. we too are soaring with that message from hand to hand, horse to horse, all the way back to Tanais. Spartacus will have read of these matters with satisfaction, since he himself had full control of his dynastic affairs, as shown by the marriage that took place on the winter solstice of 178. In this case, the marriage was entirely to the satisfaction of the father, and at least considered honourable by the son. Prince Dion was married to the daughter of one of Spartacus's old friends from Cameria. This, I remind you, was what the Bosporans called the lands east of the Black Sea, including the allied colonial ports at Anacopeia. This marriage cemented the permanence of a long-standing alliance of peoples, and it can be rightly said that Camerians were as Bosporan as the Scythians or Greeks by this time, having always been the least boisterous and most helpful of the empire's frontiersmen. As for what these people were like, I offer you the report that the marriage itself took place in the snow-glazed wilderness with no care for the cold, as was the Camerian way. It is even said today that when someone is quiet yet seems to have bottomless talent, that they are an iron-legged Camerian, the iron leg part being a reference to Camerian people being fast runners, and hence often being relied upon to speed around the battlefield as if they were mounted. The solstice was chosen because in their custom, this occurrence symbolized the beginning of something new, while I, being of Greek education, paint this as the conclusion of something that had been developing for a long time. That it could be either thing to either people was, I say, the real lesson of the affair that Spartacus was offering his people by treating his inferiors with such friendly deference. That Dion be married at this time was important, for with the coming of spring, it was time for him to depart to make good on his father's dealings with the Ptolemies. A force of several thousand men and 40 ships was ready at Tanais, augmented with the same delegation of literate Lithosis I referred to prior, the Scions of Gold. It was hoped that this force would bring the empire wealth and influence in far-off lands, and hasten the coming of order to the world. It was an optimistic outlook, we can say now, making the best of what the politics of the time had sown. Doubtless, Dion had not much interest in Golden Age rituals, but the business of ingratiating himself with successors of Alexander had a golden sheen all of its own. After Greek augurs selected a good day to depart, Spartacus saw Dion off with regal poise, not knowing the torture he would ultimately be sending his child to endure, though I wonder if he had known, would he have considered it entirely unsuitable for a great man to be made to face these things. Spartacus inspected the ships in person, and when satisfied with the grandeur of the fleet, he saw it away, and then he addressed the royal court on the manner in which they should rule the growing city, aptly saying nothing of the empire for now, and then he ordered his household to pack all things away for a journey. It was time for Spartacus to make a tour of several months, heading west for the place on the lips of all, Apollon, the source of the Scions of Gold, the seat of Prince Pyrrhosides, and the table across which Roman devils eyed dishes they would make theirs. Spartacus left Tanais with fanfare that was insufficient for the gravity of his departure, since after all, no one there knew that they would never see their king again.